We're in for the final formal wrap-up of this week's second course, and a few comments on the two courses together, though I realize that those of you who are here, with the exception of Winston, have not been here through the whole course for continuity. Still, we have people online, and this is going to be on record for those who view the whole thing later, and maybe some of you will have an opportunity to view the sessions you missed as well. Laura, when did you come? You've been here the whole week. Or some part. I remember you weren't here.
But I came on Sunday.
So you were here. Essentially, you've seen the continuity of the course too, so I should have mentioned that. Okay. I'm going to be quite brief, and I also opened it up for any discussion or comments or critique, just as we have done in the last session. We started out with this sounds like a very ambitious, even more ambitious than new economic theory for the 21st century. We talked about, so we carefully said in our title that towards a transdisciplinary science of society. And I think a more accurate assessment would be to say we came together with a multidisciplinary group to explore whether there was any rationale and feasibility of doing this. And we have not held a formal discussion at the end of the session to even evaluate what our conclusions are. So the most I can do now is to highlight some of the points that have come up during the week, which I think are of greatest importance. And we will be writing about this and circulating it and inviting more comments, both from those who have participated as well as a wider audience within the Academy and outside to take it further. So there is no final decision about this, but I think we identified some important points to discuss. We had, for me, this has been 12 days of very, very rich discussion. Fully justifies itself as it is, and the question we'll have to answer after this is, what do we do beyond this? How would we take it forward? We started with some premises that the division of society into multiple disciplines is of increasing limited utility, or if we want to make it more positively, that there are some substantial gains to be made by exploring more clearly the unifying principles that might be linking all of the social science disciplines together. And we justified that for the same reasons, really, we justified the need for a new economic theory because of the increasing complexity, the increasing interconnections and integration, and the increasing speed of change that's taking place in the world. Our premise is that an exploration of these linkages and possible common underlying factors can enhance knowledge, and that's what we're after. The goal is not to found a discipline, the goal is greater knowledge, and I think I can speak for myself. This experience of 2 weeks has been definitely one that has generated very many fresh perspectives in me, just listening to the various presentations and trying to integrate them in my own mind. We recognize that this is not an entirely new idea, that we have a number of promising lines of transdisciplinary theory, systems theory, complexity, information theory, and I should have really listed first management theory, because much of management theory is essentially transdisciplinary and applicable across lines. We heard this week, for those of you who didn't hear him, I would recommend you listen to his presentations, because they really were an interesting contribution. Roberto Poli from University of Trento, who's a chair, UNESCO chair of the discipline of anticipation. And he's working with a small group to argue that we need to create a whole new scientific discipline that recognizes, particularly with respect to human sciences, but not exclusively, that our emphasis has been too much on causality from the past, which we've inherited from the physical natural sciences, and really missed out on the tremendous importance of human perceptions of the future and the influence of the future on our actions. And I thought those were very fascinating. And in addition, we heard from Winston about a theoretical framework developed by Harold Laswell more than 50, 60 years ago, which I think was too much, too early and too much at the time, but was based on the same fundamental rationale. He perceived that there can be a common framework linking the different disciplines together. So we asked ourselves three essential questions in starting. Are there common underlying principles applicable to all fields of accomplishment? Is there a common process applicable to all those types of accomplishment? And what is the relationship between the individual, organizational, and social accomplishment? Because there's a tendency that our sciences focus on one or the other. They focus on the psychology of the individual or the sociology of the society or the performance of a business organization or a government entity and so forth. But we don't have any science that really integrates all these dimensions. And we set some objectives for ourselves. I think I showed this slide yesterday, so I won't go through it again, but I'm going to touch on a number of these points as we go through. We had a very interesting discussion on the first day about similarities and differences between the natural and social sciences. And though we also agreed that we need to discuss this further, we had a colloquium at CERN in March on this subject with a group of CERN scientists, where we were really looking at what are the similarities and differences, what can the social sciences learn, and what maybe they should forget from the natural sciences. And it was a very fruitful discussion, and we had a number of things here. I think when we look at the natural sciences, and maybe that CERN meeting was one of the reasons for going ahead with this, because it was such a fruitful discussion. When we look at the natural sciences, we see that there is a natural commonality and integration between the disciplines. All of chemistry are built on principles of physics. And the chemist doesn't ignore physics. He simply builds higher order structures on that. All of genetics, biology, zoology are built on fundamental premises of physics and chemistry, and geology and climate, meteorology and so forth. There is a connection between all of them. There are not only lateral connections between them, but there's a certain hierarchy which is not meant to imply a superiority of importance or anything like that, but we recognize there are different layers. Yet, more by and large in the social sciences, each social science has its own set of premises, its own constructs, its own definitions, and constructs reality more or less independently from the others. That may be more true in some areas and less true than others, and we can discuss it further. But I think there's clearly a difference between them. In the natural sciences, it's really a study of the objective external world. And to a large extent, with the exception of psychology by definition, but even the psychology has tended to be more positivistic than subjective, But to a large extent, the social sciences have also focused primarily on the objective phenomenon and given secondary importance to the subjective reality. Our premise was that a real science of society would have to recognize and give equal weight to these two parts of reality. And to illustrate that, we had a number of discussions to illustrate this. I mentioned one of them, I think, yesterday or the day before, the example of FDR. When FDR was faced with the banking crisis in 1933, he did, in fact, take a number of objective steps, introducing the deposit insurance and other things. But he recognized that the primary thing he had to do was change psychological perceptions about the economic system and get people to act in a different way. And he directly appealed to psychology. We had a presentation by Janani Harish in which she gave two inspiring examples. One was Winston Churchill during the Battle of Britain, when all the objective data showed that Britain didn't have a chance against the Germans, that they had 5 times as many planes and pilots, they were way ahead in terms of armaments, and yet the subjective factor of a courageous, inspiring leader he didn't take a vote of the people, shall we fight or not, he said, we will never surrender. And he inspired the country.
It's helped a bit by the Americans, to be fair.
Well, I'm talking about the Battle of Britain. And I don't think Britain had as much help as it would have liked during the Battle of Britain. It was pretty well on its own at that stage. I don't mean World War II. I mean, Hitler's assessment was that within 6 weeks at the maximum, Britain would collapse and the war in Europe would be over because there was nobody left. France had already capitulated. But actually, after 3 months, the Germans withdrew because it had just been so costly and they saw no hope of turning it around. And then Janani ended one of her presentations with the speech of Henry V in Shakespeare's Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt, which is a historical fact of about 500 years old, when the English in France were outnumbered. The English army was outnumbered about 5 to 1. They had been fighting for months and were trying to retreat, and now the French launched this huge force against them. And at the end of in Henry, in a very inspiring way, he says, any of you who want to leave now, you're free to go, but you'll look back one day and curse the fact that you weren't here to be part of this battle. And the historical fact, though they're not exactly sure of the numbers, but the historical fact is that the French lost somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 soldiers, including a very large number of knights. And the total English casualties were 100, which is just inexplicable from a clearly objective understanding of what military science is about. So we have been exploring for the last 2 weeks the fact that in social science, in social accomplishment, you can never undervalue the importance of the subjective factor, whether it's in war or peace or business. And of course, every leader, whether he's a political leader or a business leader, knows this from experience. But our science hasn't really come to grips with that quite as well. We also know that if social science is not as advanced as the natural sciences are, there are some good reasons for that. It's not a criticism of social science, and Ido spoke to it in his opening remarks, and I think maybe yesterday he mentioned it again. The fact of the matter is social reality is much more complex than anything in the material world, certainly much more complex than physics, for the simple reason that we have all of the physical reality to cope with, that the physicist or the meteorologist has to cope with. We too have to cope with that. but we've also got to cope with the mental reality, the mental perceptions, the levels of knowledge, understanding that we have, and the emotional realities that we have as human beings, our feelings, our emotions, our sentiments, our desires, our needs. And so we're dealing with multiple planes of reality. It's quite natural that the physical sciences, which deal with one plane, should evolve more rapidly or be further ahead, apart from the fact that they started a few centuries earlier. Ivo has stressed, and Ian stressed in his remarks yesterday, that we also need to keep in mind that the laws governing social reality are really laws created by us, human beings. They're based on our attitudes, perceptions, decisions, choices we've made, the values that are explicit or implicit in the systems we've created. I think it was Willy Brandt in his preface to the report of the Brandt Commission, Common Crisis was the first report. He said in the preface, we start with the premise that the problems created by man can be solved by man. It's an expression of this principle. And we also recognize, and I alluded to it yesterday, but we spent a whole week talking about this subject, and it was really fascinating, was in the physical world, individuality is a very small aspect of reality. We don't talk about the individuality of quantum particles or atoms. Every atom of iron and gold and manganese is identical. The only difference between one quark and another is that it may be in a different place, traveling at a different velocity, but fundamentally the properties are the same. And yet, as we've seen with the evolution of society, human beings, we in some ways tend to become more similar in the way we dress, in the way we talk, in our manners and all, and in our knowledge. But in other ways, we become increasingly capable of diversity, increasingly capable of expressing uniqueness. And if we look at accomplishment in the social field, we're faced with the reality that virtually all great accomplishment has as its origin, as its root, at different places, at different points behind it, the actions of unique individuals. 1, 10, hundreds, thousands. And to dramatize this, I started the week with the story of these two guys who started out in a garage in 1976 and built the first prototype of the Apple computer, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. By 1984, they had a $2 billion company with a few thousand employees, and they were one of the largest PC makers, though by then IBM PCs were flooding the market. Jobs was thrown out of the company, having, after designing the Macintosh and launching the Macintosh, the first graphic user computer with a graphic user interface and multiple fonts and all of those things, which had already changed the industry, and which Windows has been imitating ever since. He went on and started a new company called Next in order to prove that his being thrown out of Apple was their mistake and not his. He had been so humiliated. Invested about $50 million in a factory that could produce 40,000 computers a month, but he could only sell 400 of them because they were beautiful, magnificent computers, and the factory was a work of art, but they were just too damn expensive for compared to what else was on the market. And then he ended up buying a company called Pixar from, what's his name? I keep forgetting it, the guy who wrote Star Wars, produced Star Wars. George Lucas. Lucas had built a computer company with computer animation equipment, software, so you could make motion pictures by computer, which nobody had done up until then. He was selling them to Disney and a few people, but he couldn't make money at it. They were too expensive. And Jobs thought maybe he could do something better. He invested $7 million in Pixar, and after a year was bleeding money and realized this was a terrible investment, and there was no way to make this a profitable company. But he had a little department in Pixar which was making sample videos to show what the software could do. And a guy named John Lasseter was the head of the department, and he came to Jobs at a time when the company was bleeding money and he was cutting staff, and said, look, I've got this idea for a short animated film, completely computerized. I call it Tiny Toy. And I need $250,000 for it. And against all of his business instincts, Jobs gave him the money. They produced the 3-minute video, put it in it came up for the Academy Awards and won the Academy Award as the first fully computerized motion picture, animated motion picture, short motion picture. Disney came along and said, we want to make it into a full-length motion picture called Toy Story. They spent $50 million on it in collaboration with Pixar. The film grossed $280 million. And after that, Pixar was launched. 10 years later, Jobs sold Pixar to Disney for $7.3 billion. His $7 million investment had multiplied in value 1,000-fold, and he had changed another industry. And then he came back to Apple, and when he was invited back to Apple, they brought him back because though Next had been a failure, Apple really needed a new operating system, and it turns out the operating system Jobs had developed 10 years earlier was exactly what, just 10 years ahead of time. They paid $500 million for a company he had spent only $50 million on. And when he came back, Michael Dell offered a public advice to Steve Jobs. My advice to Jobs is to liquidate the company and give whatever value you can get to the shareholders. That was at a time when Apple's share had gone from 15% to 4% of the U.S. PC market. He launched the iMac and then the iPod. The iPod was such a radical change that within a few years, 45% of Apple's income wasn't coming from computers anymore. It was a music company. In fact, it became the largest music company in the world. Then he opened the Apple stores against all the advice of the Apple board that said specialty stores like this just won't work. And he outsold Tiffany's in New York per square foot, double the rate of sales of the Tiffany's in New York with his Apple store, and spread them around the world. Then, of course, the iPhone, and then the iPad. And by the time he died a couple of years ago, this was the most valuable company in the history of the world. And it is still that now, today, over $600 billion in market cap. Now, the growth of the PC industry is something that was happening by itself. He didn't invent all of that technology and everything. But it's very hard for us to imagine that the world would be exactly the same today if this one individual hadn't been there. He's an exceptional example, but he's not a sole example. India certainly would be independent today if Mahatma Gandhi had never been born. I have no doubt about that. Probably they would have fought a big war over it and done it. Slavery would have been abolished in the U.S. even if there had never been Abraham Lincoln growing up in a log cabin. No doubt about it. I'm not sure the America would be one united country as it is today if it hadn't been for Lincoln, because the country was just so precarious. It was at the point of breaking up into splintering into something that looks more like the states of Europe than what we have today. But there have been millions of individuals who have contributed to uniquely in making a quantum leap forward, whether it's in a business or in a politics or in a discovery of a new idea, whether we call him a genius or a great musician or a great author or whatever it is. And somehow our science of society has to take into account we are not just a question of norms and numbers and quantity. Qualitatively, one individual can change the world and does change the world, whether it's the world of his family or the world of his community or the world of an industry or the world of the world. We have enough historical examples, we simply can't ignore it, and science can't ignore it if we really want to understand what this thing is that society is. So individuality and uniqueness is something in the social sciences that we have to take into account. We also recognize, as I mentioned, that in the social sciences we're dealing with multiple levels of reality. I gave the example of FDR to say, FDR understood the solution to the banking crisis was not just getting money, it was not just a physical thing, it was a social and a psychological phenomenon, and he acted at all of those levels. And therefore our economic science, which of course all economists recognize that if you lose confidence in the marketplace, you can undermine your economy. What changed in 2008? There was no physical objective factor that precipitated the crisis. A change in perceptions and a change in emotions precipitated the crisis. Well, I've talked to this, so I won't repeat it now. We also explored the example of, a fascinating example of J.P. Morgan in the 1907 financial crisis, when there was no Fed. There was no regulation of the U.S. banking system at that time. One trust, the Knickerbocker Trust, went bankrupt in New York, and suddenly everybody who was dependent on that trust, their contracts in the financial market, their commercial contracts failed, and confidence was lost. There was a panic. People started running to the other trusts to withdraw their money. There were no institutional mechanisms to handle a crisis at that time. Of course, we've been having crises every decade or so for the previous 50 years. And it finally came down to the actions of one man, J.P. Morgan, who didn't have any legal authority or institutional authority. He called together the bankers of New York on his personal reputation, simply because he was a man who was so trusted. He was so trusted that the American government gave him $25 million, not him personally, but said, we will back whatever your plan you have by $25 million. The government didn't have a plan, and they didn't know how to handle it. And it came down to the point where he sat with the bankers in New York, and they went down the list of the trusts and the banks, and they said, these are the ones that are too weak to save, and we'll have to let them fail. These are the ones we're going to support. Pool your money together, which there was no legal mechanism to compel one bank to pool money and back the survival of other banks. But when Morgan said it, they did it. It came to the point where the president of the New York Stock Exchange came to Morgan and said, if we don't get another $25 million in the next 1 hour, we're not going to be able to complete our trading orders and the commitments that have been made, and we'll have a panic in the market. And Morgan called all the bankers together and said, 25 million more, we need it right now. They gave the 25 million, and within a half an hour, 23.5 million had been absorbed by the market. And they were wondering how on earth are they going to survive for another 30 minutes. Somehow that was enough to revive confidence. And the market closed and the panic was over. And the result of that, after years of investigation and analysis, the U.S. government decided to create a new institution called the Federal Reserve. The origin of the Federal Reserve was an institutionalization of what an individual had done. So it's not just that the society is made up of individuals and sometimes we have an extraordinary one. Here's a process of an individual giving birth to an institution. And of course we see that in companies all the time. It's a process that's going on all the time. But we don't really usually understand the relationship between the psychological capacities of an individual and the sociological capacities of the institutions that we've built up in society. Clearly, these are interesting and significant areas for further understanding. And I mentioned yesterday that when we're talking about social realities, we're talking about realities that impact individuals, organizations, the social context, the physical environment, and the particular circumstances in space and time. And if you look at any of the stories I've mentioned, they all illustrate that. In the case of Jobs, the fact of the matter was he was of the baby boom generation. He grew up in the hippie generation in Silicon Valley. If he had been grown up in Alabama or Mississippi, I'm sure we would have never had a Macintosh. He was born in a society where the kids, instead of putting together car engines, which they did in other parts of the country, or riding on horses, or shooting with guns, what they did as a hobby was they assembled electricals and electronics, because that was the thing of that generation. He had all the values of the hippie generation. You know, when they released the Macintosh in 1984, they put this ad in the Super Bowl, 1-minute ad in the Super Bowl for $1 million, in which they played on George Orwell's projection that in 1984 would be the year of authoritarianism dominating the world. And he showed this hammer-throwing Olympic athletic lady running through a field of robots, the automatons of humanity who were being dominated by the machine, who were being addressed by this Big Brother's character on the video, which for him, the Big Brother's name was IBM. And she takes this hammer and throws it at the screen and smashes it, and then find out why 1984 is not going to be 1984. And then they show announcing the introduction of the Macintosh computer. And that was the ad. And it was rated the best ad that had ever been, voted the best ad that had ever been launched. He was a missionary. He wasn't just a marketing guy. He had a missionary zeal to passion to make machines work for us rather than us submit to the machine. Okay, and as Roberto Poli was reminding us, when we're dealing with social realities, we can't understand any social outcome simply in terms of what's happened in the past. Past is important. It sets up our perceptions, beliefs, it puts forces in motion, it creates institutions, barriers, and resistances. But we've got to take into account perceptions of the future. Human beings are driven more by our aspirations and our perceptions of what's going to be possible in the future. Our theory needs to do that as well. And I mentioned yesterday, I'm not going to go into it, there are so many factors that are rapidly altering the complexion of our future that make it more and more important for us to take the future into account in our approach to understanding social phenomena and action. And in fact, in thinking about an economics for the 21st century, we're really saying that in the 21st century, things are changing and evolving so quickly, we simply have to have a forward orientation. Things can't go on as before. We have to think about the implications 10, 50, even 100 years later. So these are the things we've been discussing this week, and I'd just like to end my part of this by thanking all those who have participated. We've had a total of 9 faculty for the 2 courses. Actually, all but Mila were also in this course, so we've had 8 in this course. We had 4 in the first course, and I'd like to thank all of you who have participated, all of you who are here or not here, and contributed your ideas and helped stimulate us. We've also had 10 panelists for the 2 courses, 9 of them here, and Ashok Natarajan, who's attended almost every day. He missed just the last 2 days of this session. I'd like to thank all of you for coming, for sharing your thoughts, for contributing, for helping us, thinking with us, brainstorming, and making this a real, live, and valuable experience. I asked my staff this morning to tell me how many people had attended the course online because I had really lost track in the days, and I was pretty surprised. I was actually shocked to hear that over the last 2 weeks we've had 74 different people from different countries participating in one or more sessions. Some of them, like Ashok, like Carl Lindgren, who was here all week. Robert Hoffman joined us for the last 2 days. A number of friends from Italy, from India. We had some from Philippines. We had somebody from Ghana. We had a number from Canada and North America. And keeping in mind the time differences, which really makes that extraordinary, because we had somebody log in from San Francisco, from Berkeley actually, for Alberto's 9 a.m. speech one morning, which meant it was midnight for them, and we were starting, and they were there for the course. So we know we haven't quite figured out the technology to eradicate time zones yet, which is certainly a barrier to this approach. But we'd like to thank all of you who have joined in from remotely, and hope you enjoyed the program. And I'd also like to request all of you who haven't had a chance to share all your ideas. I'm sorry if we've missed any of the questions that may have come. We had a technology problem here where sometimes I couldn't access the questions during the session, and it's possible we missed a few. But we'd like your feedback on the course. Please send us your frank feedback. Technically, what could be done better? Content-wise, what you thought of it? Suggestions for the future? Anything you want to tell us, we'd like to know how we can do it better in the future. And you're the best ones to tell us. And finally, I'd like to thank the staff of Mother Service Society. The 7 I have put up here, all of whom have worked on various parts of this project. Half of them have been working every day behind the scenes so that we could sit here and I don't have to worry about anything, but sending out the links and making sure the connections and recording everything and being sure that it's going to be all up on the web and on record. All the video, all the audio, and all the PowerPoint presentations will be on the web. We will notify everyone who has attended the course as soon as those are up. They're working on last week now. It may be another week. I have to carry back some of these files, recorded files, before we can do this week. But I'm sure within a week or 10 days maximum, it'll all be up there, and we'll send you the links so you can access it. So with that, I'd like to just open it up for any comments, thoughts, brainstorming, anything we haven't discussed that you want to discuss, anything you think we should discuss in future, any advice you have about how we might proceed or not proceed on this. Ian.
I thought your description of natural sciences and social sciences is interesting. It strikes me that if we believe we're in the era of the Anthropocene, and if you look at the last 2 major scientific assessments that I can think of, one is climate change and the other is the Millennium Assessment on biodiversity, 50% of both of those were about the anthropogenic dimensions.
Exactly.
So we are, in fact, it's not quite as clear cut as much as it was 30, 40 years ago. We are coming together. I just wonder whether the notion, the concept of the Anthropocene is not one we should embrace a little stronger, because it is the integrating between the natural sciences and social sciences.
Well, it's really appropriate, and especially appropriate for the Academy. We've actually had 2 conferences on the Anthropocene, and now I forget his name. The scientist who coined the phrase, Crutzen. A fellow of the Academy, and we were inspired by that to take it up as a theme. So it's doubly appropriate that we have not directly tied it into this initiative, but it's a very excellent, it's a good idea.
The second one is just simply, I think you're really onto something on prediction. If you look at all predictive capacities in economics, it's essentially econometrics, which is essentially statistical regression, which makes a fancy set of assumptions about what happened historically will happen in the future. If you look at hydrological planning, or you look at the 1 in every 200 flood, the 1 in every 20-year flood, you use history to predict the future. Problem, of course, is we're having 1 in every 200-year floods about every 10 years at the moment. So the notion of prediction being a function of history, and Henry Ford said all history is bunk. I don't necessarily believe that, but I think when it comes to predictive capacity, it's not far wrong. And I think we have to design our future, not predict it. I think we should get away from prediction and into design, as it were.
That's a really nice statement.
Perhaps what conclusions you draw from your examples of Steve Jobs? I mean, great leaders produce good and bad outcomes. Big leaders, but we call them great, produce bad and good outcomes. There's probably as many bad examples that were catastrophic.
Certainly.
Not least, for example, in not very far from here,
Certainly.
not very long ago.
Certainly.
What do you draw from that? I mean, Jobs created a massive company. He also created a company that was based on planned obsolescence. I mean, when you buy an iPhone, you can't actually change the battery in the damn thing, as I'm discovering now. If you want a piece of equipment that goes in it, you pay about 50 times more than it costs to produce. So I'm kind of curious, what are you drawing out of your understanding of individual greatness?
Good question. We had a whole week on this subject, and I've taken one example to highlight one aspect, but our discussion went on these lines, that the process of the individual is the catalyst for social change. Whether it's the individual who happens to be president of the United States, or a clergyman, or we gave the example of Rosa Parks, who was a 42-year-old woman riding on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, happened to unleash a movement in a town where the clergyman's name was Martin Luther King, and she refused to get off, to move back to the back of the bus. Individuals catalyze processes that then become group processes. And therefore, when we want change, we need to understand the idea, I'm only an individual, what can I do? But throughout history, it's only individuals who have been launching, I don't mean, it's sometimes groups of individuals, but even with a group, there's somebody who starts the group, there's somebody who gets the idea, there's somebody who says, let's do something about it. So whether that's positive or negative, I'm just saying if we want to understand, that's the one part. The other part of it is that in the individual it's much clearer that the psychological elements are a powerful determinant of what we do outside, of the types of values we have, the types of actions and decisions we take, the types of organizations we create. And we're trying to show that there's a continuity. Our society is not just some external apparatus unconnected from us. Our society has become an objectification of our individual psychology, built up and organized, and it acquires its own dimensions, its own characteristics socially, but it has grown out of us. Why is that important? When we look at the future, we often have the feeling we're faced with a system, an impersonal big brother system. What can we do? This is the way corporate law is. This is the way democracy works. This is the way money rules the world. There's no way. We're no longer aware of the connection between what we as individuals are, or the emotional potential or intellectual potential we have, and the way the world works. We think if we're going to build a better world, we need to reestablish and recognize that the real power comes subjectively.
Let me take another line on that.
Okay.
When we look at the future of the world, you can also make the case that cooperation will have to start replacing competition. And one element of our economic system is competition is good for everyone. And we've sort of discovered it's good for some, but not for everyone. That collaboration might replace competition. That cooperation is the name of the game in political stability, not competition.
Yes.
And that in business, teamwork is everything. It is not the individual. It is the ability of the team. The 12-member team has a 13th member called the team. And does that conflict with...
Absolutely not. In fact, we had a whole... my summary was to take a few key points, and there were so many rich discussions, and one of them is Alberto's Zucconi's presentations on our social construction of reality. And the idea that we are achieving through competition is not even real. It's a social construction. We are looking at the competition. We're ignoring the fact that all our competition takes place within a wider framework of cooperation. Within a business, it's cooperation. No business can survive without the cooperation of its suppliers, its financiers, its distributors.
Our education system isn't. Our education system is essentially a competitive system. It's a ranking system in the broad order.
Even there, it's a competitive system within a wider system of cooperation. We have hundreds or thousands of faculty members that come together to educate the students. We look at the competition. We see that because that's what we've been trained to see. One of the dramatic examples of this for me was the Visa credit card system, which started in about 1970 from Bank America. Visa is now about a $5 or $6, maybe $7 trillion a year business. It involves, I don't know the numbers now, but about 20,000 banks all over the world are members of the owners of Visa. They're all competitors. They're not all direct competitors, but you can pretty be sure every bank that's a competitor with another bank, they're cooperating with each other to make Visa possible. They agree to be part of a system where all of them are issuing cards that are honored by all of the others, and they have a system for paying the vendor, the retailers, or whoever takes the card. They go through a centralized system, and they do together what none of them could do on their own. In fact, that's why Bank of America developed the bank card. It did it in California by itself, and it realized when it wanted to go beyond California, it just couldn't do it by itself. So they converted the Bank America card into a Visa, and they opened it up to the rest of the world.
Created an oligopoly.
Yeah, well...
Set prices that suited everyone within the system.
Yeah, but so I think that we tend to look at competition as if that's the dominant theme. But partly, and I agree with what you say that it has to change. I'm not challenging what you said, but even now, so much of our life is based on cooperation, but we tend to ignore that part.
Garry, I just want to congratulate you to this achievement of being more or less organized and in chair for 12 days of this. I think you must have so many new ideas in your head that your brain will need weeks in order to get in order again.
I'm looking forward to that.
That's a fabulous achievement, and I think.
Thanks, Paul.